What if I told you that one of the loudest tools in the forest started out in the operating room? And we're not talking wartime amputations here, more like labor and delivery. Hey y'all, I'm Christina and you're listening to History and Hearsay. If my voice sounds a little bit different, it's because I have a cold, which always feels really odd when it's like 80 degrees outside. So for today's episode, I was trying to pick a more lighthearted story, but I'm honestly not sure what I was thinking because this is not that story. So if you're currently pregnant, I highly recommend that you just go ahead and click out of this one. You just don't need to be putting any of this in your head. But for the rest of you brave souls, get ready to cringe. Saws for cutting wood have existed for thousands of years, with the earliest having been made of flint or even shark teeth. Copper saws found in Egypt have been dated back roughly 5,000 years. The earliest known sawmill was in ancient Rome and was used to saw stone rather than wood. Water-powered mills were in use from at least the 6th century, with some written accounts going back even further. Various two-man saws were around during this period as well. Smaller saws were used to do more detailed work, and as medical interventions expanded, saws began moving into the world of surgery. They could be used to cut bones, such as when amputating limbs, which may be where your mind immediately went when you think of surgery, but as my intro may have given away, the chainsaw was initially intended not for amputations, but for assisting in childbirth. Now, it won't come as a shock to anyone when I say that childbirth has always been a harrowing affair. While we think of it as a commonplace occurrence, childbirth can quickly turn into a life or death situation. And this was especially true in the days prior to widespread sanitation and anesthetics. One common emergency during labor is obstructed labor, where the baby cannot pass through the mother's pelvis. This can happen for various different reasons, which might include the size or position of the baby, like in a breech delivery where the baby's presenting feet first. Even in our modern day and age, it's still much more common than we like to think about that a baby can become stuck during delivery. Today, if a doctor is not able to coax the baby out with various manual techniques, the most common solution is to perform a Caesarean section, or as we often call it, a C-section. This, of course, is the surgical procedure where a baby is delivered through incisions made in the mother's abdomen and uterus. And while this also seems very commonplace to us now, it's a major surgery that has various risks associated with it. Back in the time period we're discussing today, death during childbirth was common enough that it significantly affected average lifespans. Humans around the world were familiar with the procedure that we now call the Caesarean section, but of course back then this procedure was much more rudimentary. It was done using knives and only used in the event of an emergency when the mother was close to death as a last-ditched effort to save the child. There are countless stories of babies all across the world who were saved in this way after their mother had passed away. Historians debate when the first Caesarean sections were performed, or even where the common name for this procedure came from. The most commonly cited origin for the term is that Roman general Julius Caesar was delivered in this manner. However, it's believed to be extremely unlikely because Caesar's mother went on to have 6 more children and is documented to have lived into his adulthood. And during this time, there were no historical records of any woman having survived a Caesarean section. So, for these reasons, many historians do not believe that the story of Caesar is accurate. It's believed that the term Caesarean more likely came from a later imperial decree that forbade the burial of a pregnant woman before the baby had been removed from her womb. The purpose of that law was to legalize this Caesarean type operation in order to try and save the newborn once the mother had died. Or if the baby had already passed, this procedure was done so that they could baptize the baby according to the Catholic belief that baptism was necessary for the child's soul to be saved. Historians have also suggested that the name derives from 2 Latin words that can be translated as to cut. There are various other stories about the Roman Empire and the origin of this surgery, but for now we'll just say that the Caesarean section back in those days was a crude and gruesome operation that was a death sentence for any woman. And so for this reason, it was considered to be an absolute last resort, as I mentioned earlier. If it was determined that both the mother and the baby were going to die, or if the mother had already passed away. From this point until the 16th century, the practice of post-mortem cesareans were considered necessary in the event of maternal death and became such a regular procedure that the children born to these mothers became known as cisones. I probably said that wrong, but I looked it up and could not find the proper way to say it. From this point until the 16th century, the practice of post-mortem cesareans was considered necessary in the event of maternal death and became a regular procedure in such cases. Always trying to improve, physicians looked for another option, hoping to find one that would save the life of both mother and child. In 1597, French surgeon Séverin Pinot observed the dissection of a woman who had been hanged 10 days after giving birth. And he noticed that the pubic bones were clearly free-moving in the human pelvis. He noted how the hip bones are connected at the front by a cartilaginous joint. The joint became more flexible during childbirth, and he noted how cutting it entirely could be a way to allow birth without having to resort to a C-section, as this allowed the birth canal to be widened so that the baby could be delivered more normally, as splitting of the cartilage at the joint can sometimes happen during birth on its own, even without any surgical interventions. This suggestion wasn't acted on until decades later in 1655, when a doctor divided the joint with a knife to save a child whose mother had died during birth. A similar procedure was performed in 1766, and then in 1768, French physician John Seago proposed that given the negative results from C-sections, this procedure, known as the symphysiotomy, should be performed instead. However, he wanted the French National Academy of Surgery to protect him if he were to ever catch any kind of criminal charges for performing this procedure. The Academy refused and rejected the proposed operation. In 1777, Seago finally performed the procedure on a 30-year-old woman. On the 41st day after the procedure, she sat up in bed, and on day 46, she was able to walk a few steps. 9 weeks later, she appeared before the Academy as a success story. They were so impressed that Dr. Seago was given a medal for the procedure, and the details of this procedure were written up, printed, and sent to doctors all across the world. However, as other doctors began attempting the procedure, the results were not always as successful. Sometimes the mother survived, but not the children, while other times the child survived, but not the mother. France abandoned the procedure pretty quickly, and it was never widely practiced in England or Germany. It was much more popular in Belgium, Holland, and Italy. And as the 19th century saw leaps and bounds in the safety of medical procedures, especially with the introduction of antiseptics, the development of germ theory, and the use of cleanliness procedures that eliminated cross-contamination between patients. Doctors in Italy became especially proficient at symphysiotomies. But while they were less dangerous than the old-timey C-sections, early symphysiotomies were performed with conventional surgical knives and were slow, extremely painful, and carried the risk of shock, infection, and other complications. So, to help speed things along and hopefully save more lives, doctors started trying to come up with devices to help with these surgeries. In the 1780s, 2 Scottish doctors were credited with both inventing similar devices around the same time. John Aiken and James Jeffrey both published papers for devices that would be the precursors of the modern chainsaw. In 1785, John Aiken described his device as a flexible knife with a link of chain held between 2 handles like a wire saw. This device was able to be used to cut the symphysis joint without damaging the bladder or any of the surrounding areas. Around that same time, Dr. James Jeffrey was said to have thought up a similar device, like I said, but claimed he had simply been unable to produce the device until 1790. In 1806, he published a work that included a 1782 paper and a translation of a French paper from 1806 talking about the use of a chainsaw. He describes his device as a saw with joints like the teeth of a watch for the removal of diseased joints, which he claims he envisioned shortly after the 1782 paper was lent out to surgeons in the 1790s. Jeffrey said his blade was better than a knife because it made smaller incisions and did less damage to nearby veins and muscles. Both Aiken and Jeffrey's chainsaws were better than knives because they were more accurate, quicker, and less painful. These blades had chains, but were more similar to a wire saw, which could be wrapped around the pelvic bone, and the doctor would then alternate each handle and quickly cut through the symphysis joint. As horrific as this sounds, these chainsaws really helped to speed up the operation, which means it was successful at reducing the pain and trauma inflicted during the procedure. In the 1830s, a further invention was created by a German physician and bone specialist, Dr. Bernhard Heine. He had spent years searching for less invasive and damaging tools for surgery. In 1830, he presented his new tool, which he dubbed the osteodome. His invention specifically dealt with bones as opposed to childbirth, and he wrote about his experiments to find a solution. In his writings, he talked about the laborious task of opening the spinal canal in corpses, and after several experiments at devices to make his job easier, he started to wonder why were bones treated with a knife like the soft parts. This is when he came up with the osteodome, which was quite different than the Scottish doctor's inventions. Instead of having two handles, it had only one, and it had a sprocket wheel to turn the chain, which carried small teeth that sat at an angle. So although this wasn't electric, the crank was like manual, it functioned very much like a modern chainsaw. Previously, amputations had been performed using chisels or hand-operated bone saws, which were slow to use and subjected patients to excruciating hammering or jerking motions. The osteotome, by contrast, cut through bone quickly and smoothly, minimizing trauma and post-operative complications. The invention was highly praised and widely used. A 1836 dissertation spoke of how the osteotome far outshined other instruments, and it quickly became indispensable for every surgeon. This device continued to be used all the way into the 1890s when it was replaced by the simpler, more effective Gigli saw. Invented by Italian obstetrician Leonardo Gigli, this saw consists of a flexible twisted wire that is designed to be used with specialized handles. The twisted wire creates a cutting edge that is very effective at cutting bone very precisely, and it allows for less trauma to surrounding tissues. The inventor of this device suggested that it could be used in various other applications outside of childbirth, such as amputations and even in brain surgeries where pieces of skull needed to be removed. And because of the flexible nature of the wire, allowing for very smooth and precise cuts, even in tight or curved areas, the Gigli saw is still used for these types of procedures to this very day. So obviously this was a very big step forward in the world of medical devices. However, even when performed with the most modern instruments, the symphysiotomy had pretty devastating side effects for the mothers. While their lives were being saved, many of them lived with chronic pain, incontinence, and loss of mobility after undergoing this procedure. So obviously, symphysiotomies were a very risky and dangerous procedures, and there were plenty of physicians who were more interested in using the Caesarean section as an alternative, or even trying to make this the go-to procedure. But as we touched on, and you probably can imagine, the practice of Caesarean sections on live women was extremely dangerous. Lack of medical knowledge and rudimentary surgical techniques meant that the maternal survival rate of those undergoing cesarean sections was slim to none. Infections, blood loss, and other risks associated with doing this surgical procedure in a non-sterile environment contributed to high mortality rates. So the question of when cesarean sections started being performed on live women is another one of those questions that historians debate. In 1337, Beatrice of Bourbon, the wife of King John of Bohemia, and her child were both reported to have survived a cesarean section. However, historians can't agree if this is an accurate account or not. The next account we have is from the 1500s in Switzerland. It's from a butcher and a pig gelder, aka pig castrator, named Jacob Neufer, who is said to have performed a cesarean section on his wife, Elizabeth. The story goes that Elizabeth had been attended by 13 midwives for 6 days without any success. The baby was not coming. So in desperation, after seeking permission from the town's mayor, the man took a butcher knife, cut open his wife's womb, and pulled out their baby. He then sutured the abdominal wound. You guys know I already struggle with pronunciations, but whenever my nose is stuffed up, it's like so much worse. This video is taking me like twice as long to get through, so give me a thumbs up. He then sutured the abdominal wound in the same way that he stitched up his pigs. Both mother and child survived, and she went on to have 5 more children vaginally. This was recorded in 1582 by the Swiss physician Gaspard Bauhand. Of course, this would have been incredibly rare, and the fact that it wasn't recorded until more than 80 years after the fact is part of why many doubt its accuracy. Additionally, in this same publication, Francois Rousset recommends the performance of a cesarean section in live women for complications during birth. Quite noteworthy is the fact that Rousset had never performed a cesarean section himself. He simply reported 14 successful cesareans, some of which are believed to have been impossible, such as the reporting that 6 cesarean sections had been performed on this same woman. Moreover, he proposed that the uterine wound should not be sutured, arguing that the uterus would stop bleeding naturally. Unfortunately, his erroneous observations were accepted as valid for centuries. The first well-documented cesarean section on a live woman took place on April 21st, 1610. The professor who recorded the story was an eyewitness to the event. The patient was a woman who had suffered a uterine rupture as a result of a fatal accident. The child survived, but unfortunately, the mother passed away 25 days later due to infection. Cesarean sections were performed without the use of anesthetics, and the abdomen was opened outside the rectus muscles in order to preserve the bladder, while the uterus was sectioned long ways. After removing the newborn, the uterus was not sutured, as I mentioned, and the abdominal incision was closed with a few thick stitches, and sometimes an ointment would be applied. The high maternal mortality rate led several esteemed surgeons to raise their voice against performing these operations on live women. Several prominent 17th century obstetricians advocated for only allowing cesarean sections to be performed if the mother had already passed away. The cesarean section became a challenge for doctors to conquer. Experiments such as hysterectomy began being done on animals, and autopsies started being done on women who had undergone cesarean sections. These studies revealed that the uterus, in fact, did not heal spontaneously after being opened up, which led to the conclusion that the lack of sutures was the cause of the internal bleeding, which of course was a very big discovery. Then in the early 17th century, another big step was made when the forceps were invented. You've probably seen these before, but these were essentially specialized tongs that were designed to manually assist with the delivery of a baby, basically just helping to pull the baby out. Now, the guy who invented these kept them so secretive at first that he would blindfold the mothers and have the midwives leave the room before he would use his invention on them in order to keep it secret. Can you imagine? I would be like, why are you blindfolding me and why does she have to leave? Like, I don't know that I would trust that. After his death, his son made the invention public and sold forceps to medical students at what was said to be an exorbitant price. The use of forceps really helped with reducing the need for cesarean sections, thus helping to decrease maternal mortality. Of course, as the years went on and cesareans were still needed, doctors worked to perfect their techniques in order to try and save the life of both the mother and the child. Finally, in 1793, surgeon James Barlow performed the first cesarean section on record in England, where the mother, Jane Foster, survived. In 1830, an American doctor, Dr. John L. Richmond of Ohio, performed what is considered to be the first successful C-section in the United States. It was considered successful because he saved the life of the mother. Now, I'm going to try not to be super graphic, but this story is pretty gruesome, so if you don't want to hear it, go ahead and use the timestamps to skip past it. But in his account, published in the Western Journal of Medicine and Physical Sciences, Richmond paints a dramatic picture of attending to a mother in labor in a half-finished log cabin in the middle of a thunderstorm. The wind kept coming in through the gaps in the walls and blowing out his candles. The doctor's account talked about how the baby was uncommonly large and the mother was very fat. They did not mince words back then. It kind of makes me wonder if maybe this mother had gestational diabetes, because that can sometimes cause both the mother and the baby to gain weight pretty rapidly. I didn't look to see if there were any theories on that, but that's just immediately where my mind goes when I read this. So anyways, Dr. Richmond is performing this C-section and all he has are a pair of crooked scissors, which is horrifying enough, but he's also fooling around trying to do this in essentially complete darkness. He doesn't have anyone who's assisting him with this procedure, and so he says that the size of both the mother and the baby was making it extremely difficult to try and get the baby out, and this poor mother is screaming in pain. She says that she can't handle it anymore, and she begs him to stop. This is when Richmond says that he doesn't see how he's going to get the baby out. He decided a childless mother was better than a motherless child, and so he decides to switch course and just try and save the mother. So he removes the baby in pieces from the mother, which has got to be one of the worst things I've ever read in my life. Now, shockingly, this mother survived and returned to work only 24 days later. I don't think I even have anything to say. That is just so, unbelievably horrific. Even with all of the medical advancements that were happening, the mortality rate for C-sections was still incredibly high and was around 85% until the 1860s. In the mid-19th century, the arrival of anesthesia revolutionized the world of surgery. First with nitrous oxide and then ether, and finally with the discovery of the anesthetic properties of chloroform, operations became much safer and more precise as doctors could take their time during the operation and examine the areas they were working on rather than just trying to work as quickly as humanly possible because they had a patient that was needing to be held down while they were in excruciating pain. Around the same time in 1847 is when the Hungarian physician Ignaz Semmelweis noted that puerperal fever was caused by poor hand hygiene of the personnel who were delivering these babies and started recommending hand washing protocols. Now, I did an episode on this whole topic if you guys want to check it out when you're done with this one, but in 1862 is when the scientist Louis Pasteur proved the existence of bacteria and their role in infections. 3 years after that is when Joseph Lister implemented the sterilization of operating rooms. In 1894, the American surgeon William Stewart Halstead began to recommend the use of surgical gloves at Johns Hopkins Hospital, and this practice spread to other hospitals around the world. All these advances, together with the systematic improvement of cesarean section techniques, contributed to the reduction of the maternal mortality rate. Thankfully, as advancements in anesthesia, infection control, and techniques continued, symphysiotomies fell out of use in the 20th century. Today, 20% of all babies born worldwide are delivered by Caesarean section, and the maternal mortality rate associated with this procedure are 0.1 to 0.16%. The latter part of the 19th century also saw the invention of chainsaws in their more modern form. Prior to the 19th century, saws were rarely used to cut down trees. During that time period, axes were used for cutting down and debranching trees, while saws were used for cutting them down to size. Early versions of mechanical saws were just too heavy and cumbersome to be of practical use in the forest. In 1883, Frederick L. McGaw of Flatlands, New York, patented an endless chainsaw, which, like the Osteotome, had chain links with saw teeth to produce boards. In 1905, Samuel Benz of San Francisco added a guide frame in his patent with the intention of using the machine to cut down giant redwoods. In 1918, Canadian James Chan patented the first portable chainsaw. He came up with the idea while he was building a fence on his land and found that the barbed wire pulled by his horses had cut clear through a 7-inch post. He built his first prototype using his son's bike chain, but his largest contribution was a 1-lugger motor, which allowed the machine to be portable. He failed to sell the machine and let his rights lapse in 1930, which allowed further development by others. Joseph Buford Cox, an American, examined the larva of a timberman beetle and noted how it used its jaws to cut side to side instead of straight ahead. This inspired him to invent the chipper-type chain, which he began producing in the 1940s. Most modern chainsaws use chains based on this innovation. Swiss inventor Andreas Stihl did so much for the advancement of the chainsaw that he was hailed as the father of the chainsaw. In 1926, he patented the cutoff chainsaw for electric power. This was the first electric chainsaw and was a very large machine weighing 106 pounds. It had 3 horsepower and required 2 operators. In 1929, he built the tree felling machine, a gas-powered saw. This came 2 years after the German company Dalmar had invented a similar one. This machine weighed 101 pounds and had 6 horsepower. In 1930, Stihl created the first chainsaw that could be operated by just one person. During the Great Depression, the American lumber industry had contracted, so when timber demand soared with the advent of the U.S. joining the Second World War, the new generation of chainsaws were a godsend. Demand for wood was driven by the need to build ships, planes, crates, barracks, hangars, and even small arms. Wood also began being used to replace materials deemed vital for the war effort. So many items that had been made from metal, like cutlery, were being replaced with wooden alternatives. Even clothing was being made from wood. Soldiers also used chainsaws to clear their path through dense vegetation and other obstacles on the battlefield. Felled trees and earth were key materials used for field fortifications. Timber was also used to construct barbed wire and wooden fences, create embankments, and reinforced trenches and dugouts. Trees were typically readily available and only required felling to be useful. This led to chainsaws being mass-produced as they played an important role in increasing timber production for the war effort. Many of these early chainsaws were incredibly heavy and were designed to be used by 2 people. One man held the engine while the other held a small handle near the end of the chainsaw blade. As with a lot of technology during World War II, Germans led the way with chainsaws. U.S. servicemen first encountered the German chainsaws when they entered the war and returned samples to the U.S. to be copied. German-style chainsaws became essential in helping supply the U.S. war effort with wood, particularly from the forest in the U.S. Northwest. And when the war cut off the supply of these German chainsaws, it led to American companies producing their own. Chainsaw use was rare before the war, but afterward became widespread. Over the years, the use of aluminum helped to lighten the devices, eventually leading to the inventions of the one-man chainsaws, which were still quite heavy at around 38 pounds, not like the 10-pound machines that we have today, but a far cry from being over 100 pounds like they had been. Chainsaws have essentially replaced all man-powered saws in forestry, and we now have things like chainsaw art, and of course they've been the central plots of numerous horror movies since the 1960s, which may be why some of us can't even look at one without cringing. Electric-powered saws remain in use in surgery, though they are now precision instruments that don't utilize chains. When it comes to trees and woodworking, a growing demand for timber, coupled with the desire for a faster and more efficient tree cutting method that would minimize waste, is why chainsaws have been developed into the lighter, more efficient models that we have today. But that doesn't take away from the very real, very horrifying fact that they were originally invented to help deliver babies.